This speaker is really, really excellent. He's a wonderful speaker. And of course, he got a fabulous last night. And you'll hear about that shortly. So let me ask our good friend Aaron Tyrus to please come up and introduce our speaker today.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Rabbi Mintz, the MVP of all of Aspen.
Can't hear.
Put it on your belt.
Here?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. You're in for a treat, everybody. I know our speaker very well. He starts off very lucky. He looks like Superman. His wife looks like Wonder Woman. Rachel, where are you? They stand up, Rachel. They got to see Wonder Woman. The background of this speaker is really, really marvelous. And he does things that I know nobody else has done. Roy was born in Venezuela, 1982, just 43 years old. He came to America with his lovely parents, wonderful people, and he decided he was going to become a member of the Federalist Society, which is a well-known organization. He got himself to meet President Trump in his first term at the airport. Donald Trump fell in love with him, and the next thing we knew, he was a federal judge. But before that, he had the great wisdom to be a terrific assistant state attorney in the Southern District of Florida. He won every single award in the United States Attorney's Office all over the country. And then it was my luck when he walked into my office. I've been a lawyer since 1961. I know I don't look it, but I'm 89. And he walked into my office, and I have never, ever been so impressed with a human being as I was with Roy. He was and is a great attorney. Now he's a judge. And we had the good fortune to practice law together for a number of years. I made a pact with Rachel, his wife, that at night she would do what she should do, and I would do in the daytime, and he'd never become a federal judge and leave us. But he did. I don't know why what I'm about to say occurred. Maybe he could tell us when he speaks. He has dedicated his life, and I'm not exaggerating, to spreading the good story of Israel, both historically and tragically since the October 7th tragedy that occurred in Israel. He speaks everywhere. No one I ever heard had anything to say, but I can't believe it. He speaks without a note. He can give you 5,000 years of history of Israel, and he can give you everything that's going on. I believe that you will be as impressed with Roy Altman, Judge Altman, as I am. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce, I don't practice in front of him, I can say whatever the hell I want. My pleasure to introduce Judge Roy Altman.
All right, it's so nice to be with you all today. I realized I met some of you in coffee shops, I ran into you on the mountain. I had to come all the way to Aspen to meet all these Miami Jews. It's unreal. It's such an honor to...
Sir, can you lift the microphone?
Oh yes, sir. It's such an honor to be introduced by Aaron, my former law partner, and of course to be hosted by Rabbi Mintz. We have many friends in common, including of course, my own parents, Rabbi in Aventura. So we'll get right into it. As Aaron mentioned to you, I've spent basically the last 2 years since October 7th, traveling all over the country. I've been to 40 states and given over 100 speeches, been to 60 college campuses, dozens of churches and synagogues and community centers all over the country, talking about the 6 big lies, the 6 myths about the Jewish state of Israel. I've also organized 3 and now a 4th federal judges trips to Israel, the first of their kind, because I realized as I went to these places, in law schools, college campuses, that the debates that we are having about the state of Israel, whether there's a genocide, whether there's an occupation, whether there's a violation of the laws of war, these are all just legal questions with quintessentially legal answers. And I thought, who better than federal judges whose job it is on a daily basis to adduce the facts, discern the appropriate legal rule, and apply that legal rule to the facts to understand what's really going on the ground and to spread the word in their own states. And so we took 14 federal judges in March of 2024 from 14 different states. They weren't Jewish, most of them were Christian. Then we took 12 more judges in September, and then 19 federal judges just went in March. And I'm proud to say we just closed registration, so to speak, for the next trip, which will be in March. And 25 federal judges have signed up to go next March. And actually, it was in Aspen last year where I received funding from a family who wants to remain anonymous to make sure that every federal judge in the country gets a chance to go to see. By the way, there's only about 500 of us in the country or so, active federal judges, and so if you do the math, we've already taken about 10% of all the federal judges in the country just in the last 2 years. And I have to tell you what's astonishing to me is that these judges then invite me to their states, to Nebraska, Arkansas, Kentucky, Ohio, to their churches and their kids' schools, to give a speech like this, like the one that I'm giving to you today. But you know what's really special for me is I get to see how they speak to their congregations and to their friends and their family about what they saw in Israel and what they have repeatedly said in their speeches and what they have said in letters they've sent to me, which I have framed in my chambers, is that aside from marriage and their children and their appointment as federal judges, their trip to Israel, our trip to Israel, was the most transformative event of their lives. And there are good reasons for that. And what I want to talk to you about today is what it feels like to go and find out the truth. Because you see, when I go to college campuses, when I go to law schools, I've had thousands of conversations with people who see the world very differently than I do, but who just do not understand the basic facts, and they don't understand the law. And if you don't understand the facts and you don't understand the law, well, you're just hopelessly lost. So the first thing to understand is that we like to say about October 7th that 1,200 people were killed, that they were butchered, that they were beheaded, that they were mutilated, that they were burned alive in their homes. But you see, that's just a number. I have gotten a chance to go with the judges, as some of you have. I know Bobby Gilbert has been, to some of these kibbutzim. And I just want to tell you one story about one life. And that is the story of a girl named Sivan in Kfar Aza. Sivan was a young girl in her teenage years. And what they did in Kfar Aza, which is a kibbutz right on the Gaza border, I mean, it's a few hundred meters from the border. Depending on where you are, it could be 300, 400 meters from the border. And what they did in kibbutz Kfar Aza, it's very Israeli, they take the young people and they say, we're going to put you in a young adults center. They call it young adult way, is the translation from Hebrew. And they've got about 10 little homes on each side of the way. It's a little walkway. And each home is a single room. And the idea is you're 17, you're about to go to the army. We're going to teach you independence. You're going to get to do your own laundry, your own dishes, live alone. But we're not ripping off the Band-Aid completely. You're still here in the kibbutz with your parents next door. And so they had about 20 young people living on young adults' way at any given time. And at 6:50 6:39 in the morning, right at the beginning of October 7th, Hamas terrorists entered Young Adults Way. And when you walk through Young Adults Way now, it's a path actually not much bigger than this aisle. You see the buildings on either side of the way completely destroyed, blown to bits, bullet holes everywhere, charred black from the fire. Remember, so many of these young people were burned alive in their homes when they wouldn't come out. And in each home there's a sign. It says, "Asur likanes po." It's forbidden to enter here, except for the last house on the left. On the last house on the left, the door, such as it is open. And there's a sign that says, "Mutar likanes po." It's permitted to enter here. Now, I am probably the only person in the world, the Israelis tell me, who has seen the Hamas video, a 47-minute video of Hamas atrocities 3 separate times. And my wife, she says, you can't watch it again. It's damaging to the soul. And it is. It's the worst thing you have ever seen in your life. Only about 10,000 people have been shown the video. I think the Israelis made a mistake. But that's a whole conversation for another day, by not showing it to the world. 10,000 people in the world have seen it. I've seen it 3 times. The reason, by the way, is because every time I take a group of judges, not Jews, I don't think it would look right for us to sign affidavits, leave our phones outside, and for me to tell them, this is going to be the worst 47 minutes of your life. But don't worry, the only Jewish judge is just going to be right on the outside of that door. So I sit there and I watch every agonizing second of these videos, and I've done it 3 times. So I felt like I was prepared for what was going to be visible inside of that home. But you know, when I walked into the room, I saw 2 federal judges, big, tough federal judges, one from Arkansas, one from Nebraska, in tears. And I knew we were in for a completely different experience. Because you see, this is Sivan's home. She was living there alone. She had a boyfriend. Her boyfriend was in the army. And what you're struck by when you walk into a place like that is that you can feel the life of the person who was there. Her running shoes are still by the door, ready to go out for a run. Her toothbrush is still in its little cup in the bathroom next to her hairbrush. And then you walk into the main room of this little house, and you see her bra on the ground, drenched in blood. And the sofa on one side covered in blood, that's where she died. And on the ceiling, instead of a beautiful ceiling like this, 100 pockmarks of the shrapnel from the grenade that terrorists threw through the window to kill her. And then on the other side was her TV, totally destroyed. And next to the TV was, for those of you who are trial lawyers like Aaron, you'll recognize it, a big board, like we would have in a trial for a jury, of the last WhatsApp messages between Sivan and her mom. And you see at 6:39, right as the terrorists are coming in, she says to her mom, Ima, there's gunfire outside. What is it? And her mom says, don't worry, lock the door, the army will be there soon. And then again, Ima, I'm looking out the window, all my friends are dead in the street. What's happening? Don't worry, stay inside, the army will be there to save you. And then a few seconds later, Ima, they're at the door. They're trying to break in. And she said, honey, please, lock yourself in, stay inside. And then she says, I love you, Ima, they're here. And then the last thing you see on the WhatsApp messages is, Ima, I love you. Ima, and she was gone. And like that, there were 1,200 of them, daughters and sons, sisters and brothers, fathers and grandparents, butchered in the early morning of October 7th. And yet, on college campuses all over this country, we Jews are the oppressors. They raped almost 100 women and young girls. That's now clear beyond peradventure. Even the United Nations agrees. You can go onto YouTube and watch the videotaped confessions of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists who talked about how their commanders told them that sexual violence was one of the strategies of October 7th. In fact, I have a cousin who's in Sayed Sarkhanim, who's been in Gaza for hundreds of days. He's there today. And he's recovered after October 7th. The manuals in the backpacks of the Hamas terrorists who were found and captured and killed. This will all be revealed, by the way, when these cases are tried before trial court judges. And what you see over and over again in these backpacks is a list of words in Hebrew for the Hamas terrorists who, remember, were supposed to conquer the Negev. They were going to stay. And the first phrase for so many of these terrorists who were found was "take off your pants," directed at a female. And yet, in Western media outlets, we Jews are the aggressors. They took 255 of us hostage. Boys and girls, octogenarians, septuagenarians, Holocaust survivors, 24 infants and toddlers, including 2 boys, who were killed in captivity and were less than 1 year old, including Kfir Bibas, whom you all know, strangled to death in a tunnel. Hamas claims he was killed by an IAF fighter jet. If you believe that, I got a lot of things to sell you. And they held us there for 100, 300, 600. Today, it's 641 days in deep, dark, dank holes, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, without food, without water. I've met so many of these hostages who were released in prior deals. Many of them told me, including Keith Siegel and his wife Aviva, Keith being an American citizen from North Carolina, that when you're in the tunnels, the only thing you can think about is the next breath, because there's so little oxygen, hundreds of feet beneath the ground. And yet, at the United Nations, we Jews are the violators of human rights. How can this be? The moral perversion, the moral inversion, the moral confusion we see all around us, even in America today, is almost too pathetic for words. Where does it come from? Well, the first thing we do with the judges on our trips is we go to Yad Vashem. And we get a tour from the chief archivist of Yad Vashem, an amazing man. And the first time we went, he took us to a room I'd never been to before. It was early German propaganda, 33, 34. And in the center of the room is a giant cockroach dressed as a Jew from Munich in 33, early. In one eye is the reflection of money bags, Jewish wealth, Jewish finance, Jewish capitalism. In the other eye, the hammer and sickle, Jewish poverty, Jewish egalitarianism, Jewish communism. And next to it is a black and white TV. And it's Hitler. And he's giving a speech. And he says, we need to eradicate the evil of Jewish wealth, Jewish high finance, Jewish capitalism from the continent of Europe. And in the next sentence he says, and we need to eradicate the evil of Jewish poverty, Jewish egalitarianism, Jewish communism from the continent of Europe. And the video shuts off, and the head archivist of Yad Vashem, he says, most Westerners come here, and they say, I get it now. Hitler was an idiot. Jews can't be bad because they're both rich and poor. Jews can't be evil because we're both capitalist and communist. That doesn't make any sense. But you see, we are the idiots. Because we are the ones who do not understand what Jew hatred is really like. Jew hatred is like an ancient virus. It's like COVID, if you believe in that kind of thing. I told that joke in Kentucky, by the way. It could have gone either way, you know. Luckily, everybody laughed. If you're inoculated against one variety, Jews are capitalists, it'll transform itself into a separate variety. Jews are communists. Remember, in the Middle Ages, the claim was that Jews could not be trusted. Why? One reason. Because we did not have a state of our own. And now on college campuses, I am told that we are evil precisely because we have a state of our own. Jew hatred is simply the lie that any given society is willing to accept about the Jews. So we must be honest with ourselves. We must ask ourselves, what are the lies that our wealthy, powerful Western society is willing to accept about the Jews? And I'll tell you that I've gone around the country and I have accumulated 6 big lies. But Aaron tells me I got to answer your questions at the end, so I'm only going to tell you about 2 of them. Good news is, apparently Forbes wants to publish the book, and you could go buy the book and read it there. So I'm going to tell you about the 2 biggest lies, the lies that inform almost everything else. And I'll start with the lie that actually, in my view, all the other lies bleed from. And that's the lie that Jews are colonists in the land of Israel. That we are what they call settler colonialists. And by the way, there's now a whole literature about settler colonialism. At my alma mater at Columbia, there are whole law review articles dedicated to the definition of Israeli settler colonialism. Folks, this lie, like all the others, the good news is it's completely belied by all of the historical evidence. The first extra-biblical mention of the land of Israel, that means outside of the Bible. I say it outside the Bible even though we're in a religious place, because if you believe in the Bible, then it's really the end of that. But for people who are skeptical of the Bible, I think it's important to talk to them too. All of the archaeological evidence suggests that Jews have been living and governing in the land of Israel for thousands of years. The first extra-biblical mention comes from the year 1205 BC. I'm not good at math, that's why I went to law school, but my law clerks tell me that that's over 3,200 years ago. The emperor of Egypt was Merneptah. He's the 13th son of Ramses, who you've heard of, the great builder of ancient Egypt. And when Ramses died, Merneptah becomes the pharaoh because he basically kills off his older brothers. And at the end of his life, he has a palace constructed for him in Thebes on the River Nile. And he has his scribes compose a giant stele. It's like a 12-foot high basalt stone tablet, 10 inches thick. It looks like the tablets that Moses would have brought down from Sinai if Moses could carry a 10,000-pound stone. And on it, Merneptah writes all of his military accomplishments. And at the very bottom of Merneptah's stele, Merneptah writes that he brought his Egyptian army into Palestine? Of course not. No such thing has ever existed in the archaeological evidence. He brings his army into Israel. It says it in hieroglyphics in black and white and stone. And he fought the king of Israel in battle in places like Ashkelon and Gezer. Anybody been there before? 2 cities that are still in the land of Israel today. Folks, just as context, Muhammad isn't born until 570 AD. Islam isn't a thing until 609 AD. The first Arabs who are, trivia, from Arabia, not Tel Aviv, hence the name. They don't enter the land of Israel in large numbers until 618 AD. They build the big mosque on the Temple Mount in 620. Folks, that means that Jews were living and ruling in a land called Israel more than 1,800 years before Islam was even a thing in the world. But that's just the southwest border with Israel. We're going to go all the way around the country. The southeast border, what's now the state of Jordan, was ruled at the ancient times by a people called the Moabites. You may remember them from your Bible. And in 840 BC, the Moabite king was a man named Mesha, mentioned in the Bible. And Mesha was upset because he had lost some battles to the Jews, and he declared that he would wage war against them in the name of his god Shemosh. And he writes all of this in his own stele in 840 BC, which is now at the Louvre in Paris. And so he writes that he made war against the tribes of two houses in Israel. Very important, because you remember from the Bible, the house of Israel splits after Solomon. The kingdom of David in the south, the kingdom of Israel in the north. And he says, I made war against the kingdom of Judah and against the kingdom of Israel, corroborating what you see in the Bible. But then he says something else amazing. He says that he made war against the men of God, G-A-D. You remember from your Bible, God was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, one of the original 12 tribes of Israel, whose tribal residence was just on the western side of the Jordan River, what the United Nations insists on calling the West Bank. And he says, those men, the men of God, have lived in that land, the land of Israel, quote, since ancient times. Even in the 840s BC, the men who ruled the land we now know as Jordan recognized that Israel, since ancient times, was the land of the Jewish people. On the northeast border with Israel, what's now the, what are we going to call it, Bobby? The failed state of Syria. The kingdom that used to rule there were called the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire. And in 879 BC, about 39 years before Mesha in Jordan, they had a king named Ashurbanipal II, one of the great kings of the Assyrians. But he doesn't mention the Jews, so we're not going to talk about him. But we are going to mention his son, Shalmaneser III. Now, I told you that Merneptah Stele is in Cairo, Mesha Stele is in the Louvre. I haven't seen either of those, but Rachel and I did go see Shalmaneser's obelisk at the British Museum in London, and I went up to it, and I tried to touch it, and the docent said, you can't touch that? And I said, don't you know who I am? No, I didn't say that. But when nobody was looking, I did touch it. And this is a critical piece of evidence, because it comes from 852 BC, 12 years before Mesha Stele, and it relates a battle that Shalmaneser fought against 11 different kings, one of whom was the king of Israel. And his name was Ahab. You thought it was just a crazy dude who chased whales in Nantucket or whatever. But he wasn't. He was an ancient king of Israel. And he was no slouch. Shalmaneser says that he brought 10,000 Jewish warriors to the battle and 2,000 charioteers. And Shalmaneser says that he killed Ahab in the battle and destroyed the Israelite army. And then guess what? Right next to Shalmaneser's obelisk, Shalmaneser at the British Museum has his own little stele. It's like the Shalmaneser section of the British Museum. And this stele is incredible because it has very few words. It really has a procession of animals and people around the periphery of the stele. And it's people bringing food and animals and gold. And he explains what this is. This is the conquered Israelites bringing homage to their new overlord, Shalmaneser, who's seen at the very front looking like a god. And in front of him, Ahab's son, the prince of Israel, Jehu. Yehuda, is kneeling, paying homage to his vassal, his overlord. Why is that important? Because most scholars believe that this is the first facial image we have anywhere in the world of a Jew. And that Jew, folks, he wasn't in Belarus. He wasn't in Poland. He wasn't even in Brooklyn. He was in the land of Israel thousands of years ago. And then, finally, the northernmost border with Israel, what's now the, let's face it, failed state of Lebanon. The people who ruled that kingdom were called the Arameans. You know them because their language, Aramaic, was the language of the New Testament, the language of the Gospels. And their king in the 800s BC was named Hazael, also mentioned in the Bible. And this is the most important of all the stele. It's at the Israel Museum. It's called the Tel Dan stele. It was found in 1993. And you see Yasser Arafat in the Palestinian narrative has always been, there was never a such thing as King David. No archaeological evidence to support the notion that ever there was a David until the Tel Dan stele. Because in the Tel Dan stele, Hazael says that he made war against the two kingdoms of Israel, the house of Omri, one of the early kings of the house of Israel, and the house of King David, the descendants of David himself, called the Kingdom of Judah. Archaeological proof of the presence and existence of King David. Almost every scholar, not named Mahmoud Abbas, agrees. And this one is in Israel. It's in the Israel Museum for all of you to see, but not, unfortunately, to touch. It all came to an end in 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonian king, destroys the temple in Jerusalem, exiles the Jews to Babylon, what's now Iraq, and the Jews, we are there for almost 50 years, until Cyrus II, the Persian king, conquers the Babylonian Empire in 538 BC, and he takes a different view of the Jews. He says, I want you to go back to your land and rebuild your temple. And that's what we do. By the tens of thousands, the archaeological evidence on the Temple Mount shows, Jews came back in the late 500s BC and began the reconstruction of the temple, what's called the Second Temple, which would last for 600 years until 70 AD, and we're going to get there. Before we do, I want to mention one thing. After the Persians came the Greeks. A young, handsome, blonde Greek named Alexander comes in 329. He takes over Israel after defeating the Persian king at 3 great battles. And he has Israel for about 6 years. He dies mysteriously in India. His kingdom is divided among his 5 great generals. We call them satraps. Israel goes to Ptolemy, his favorite. But ultimately, in the year 200 BC, it goes to another general, the descendants of Seleucus, called the Seleucid Empire, also known as the Seleucid Greek Empire. And we live under the Seleucids for a while, but in 167 BC, it gets to be too much. The Seleucid king forbids the practice of circumcision, sprinkles pork fat onto our holy scrolls in the temple, and actually begins sacrifices to Zeus on the Temple Mount. And so there's a revolution. And the revolution begins in the town of Modi'in in central Israel, a town that's as vibrant and Jewish today as it was in 167 BC, when Judah the Maccabee and his brothers and his father, Matthias, came down from Modi'in and led a revolt, and it took a long time. People think the Gaza war has gone on for too long. This one took 27 years. But when it was done, in 140 BC, the Jews had regained their sovereignty over the whole of the land of Israel. And in fact, just like the redeemed state of Israel in 1948 was recognized first by whom? The greatest power in the world, the United States and Harry Truman. In 139 BC, the first ambassador to recognize the new Hasmonean dynasty of Jewish king sovereignty over the land of Israel was the greatest empire in the world at the time, the Roman ambassador in Jerusalem. So we have a fully sovereign Jewish dynasty of kings from 140 to 63 BC when the Romans come, and we are vassals of the Romans. This is the time, of course, of Herod the Great. He rules from 37 to 4 BC, which is a very important year. You know, most of the times I'm not speaking to Jews. I go around the country talking to church. It's nice to have some Jews in the audience. Most of the time I talk to churches, and I tell them about 4 BC, because most scholars agree that 4 BC is the year in which Jesus was born. And Jesus, of course, was born in Bethlehem, house of bread in Hebrew. Also, the United Nations insists on calling it occupied land. I'm not sure how. And when he was 1 year old, he moved to the north to Nazareth on the Galilean Sea. And he became a great rabbi of the Jewish people. And he moves down to Jerusalem. And he walks on the Siloam Road from the mikvah, the Siloam Pool, 2,000 meters up to the Temple Mount. Here again, Yasser Arafat had his facts wrong. He said the Siloam Road was a myth. It's never been dug up or found. But you see now, a few years ago, archaeologists have revealed an astonishing find. Under an Arab neighborhood in Siloam, about 12 yards underneath the earth, we have found the Siloam Pool and the Siloam Road. For the first time in 2,000 years, people have gotten to go underneath and see the Siloam Road. It's not open to the public yet. Our hope is that it will be in about 5 or 10 years, but we, the judges, we got a sneak peek. We got to go under. And on our most recent trip with all these Christian judges, one of them said to the tour guide, how far down do we need to go to be on the stones that Jesus himself walked on when he came up to the Temple Mount? And the tour guide said, no, you don't understand. These are the stones. And at that, all these federal judges from America got onto their hands and knees and started touching the stones with their face and with their hands. And that's when I noticed in one of the stones a glimmering object of some kind. I went, also on my hands and knees, put my flashlight on my iPhone on, as one does, and there it was, stuck in one of the crevices of the stone, an ancient golden coin with a menorah emblazoned on it. Hadn't seen a human being in 2,000 years. By the way, what a powerful thing that a Christian and a Jewish judge were together on our hands and knees, recognizing that in those 2 or 3 square feet of that paving stone, that ancient paving stone, lay our joint and shared heritage, our spirituality, our homeland. So Jesus, the point is, was a Jewish man who lived his whole life with all of his friends and all of his family as Jewish men and women who worshiped in the Jewish temple of Jerusalem, and who even when he died made clear that he and all of his Christian neighbors saw themselves as part of an ancient Jewish tradition, beginning with Abraham and running through King David and Moses, but finding its homeland in the Jewish state of Israel. I want to tell you about one last thing about the Romans before we move on. There's a revolt against Rome in 66, horrible revolt. It gets crushed in 70, the temple is destroyed. By the way, I had somebody, I think it was Cornell, tell me, how do we know that happened? You don't have to take my word for it. If you've ever been to Rome, you've seen Titus's arch with the burning temple in the background and the Roman legionnaires carrying the menorah and the mizbeach, the sacrificial altar, out from a burning temple. But there's a pocket of resistance. For 3 years, until 73 AD, they get caught atop a fortress in the desert by the Dead Sea called Masada. And in 73 AD, the Roman 10th Legion storms Masada, and on April the 16th, the battering ram is right at the door. The Jews inside Masada, 967 of them, decide to commit mass suicide. And they do it by drawing lots, ceramic potsherds. And they put the names of the families on each potsherd to decide which family will die first. Folks, we the judges, we climb Masada every time. You won't be surprised if I get there first every time. These old judges got nothing on me. Not even skull about me. And we get to the top, and we walk around, and what's on display? These potsherds have been uncovered from the earth. And folks, they're not in Polish. They're not in English from Brooklyn. They're in crisp, unambiguous Hebrew that any one of us who speaks Hebrew can read. And they bear the names that we even today continue to give our sons. Eliyahu and Gideon and David and Benjamin and Menachem. A tradition going back thousands of years. Which is why even today, when Israeli commandos graduate from the Special Forces Academy, they climb Masada early in the morning, and as the sun is rising from the east over the Jordanian hills, they hold a gun on one hand and the Chumash, the Bible, in the other, and they swear in unison, Ani nishba, I swear, Mitzada lo tipol sheni. Masada shall never fall again. The last revolt against Rome comes in 132. Simon Bar Kokhba comes from the north. He leads a revolt that sloughs off Roman rule for 3 years. And they do something amazing. They issue their own currency. And you can go to the Israel Museum or even the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Well, maybe that'll be gone from there pretty soon, but you can go and you can see these coins. There are thousands of them. And these coins are amazing. On the front of the coin is the facade of the Second Temple. The same Second Temple the Jews had built in 538 BC when Cyrus sent them back to Israel out of exile. And above the Second Temple is the Star of David, the Magen David, which even today adorns the center of the flag of the only Jewish state in the world. An unbelievable connection to our past. But that's not all. On the back side of the coin, in Hebrew letters, again, not Polish or Ukrainian, around the lulav, is written the words, year one, for the redemption of Israel. Year one, for the redemption of Israel. And by the way, it's because of those coins that fast forward a long time to 1948, when it came time to decide what will we call this redeemed and reconstituted Jewish state in the land of Israel, that the committee headed by Ben-Gurion voted 6-3. Let's call it Israel. Because that, 1948, was year one in the redemption of our sovereignty over our national homeland. Don't ever be confused about that. When the Romans fall in 409, the land goes over to the Byzantines. And now we begin a succession of Muslim occupations of the land of Israel. Because you see what happens? The 6 myths I'm telling you about, the myths are ingenious precisely because they hold a mirror to the truth. You see, there has been occupation in the land of Israel for hundreds of years. There has been colonization. It just hasn't been by the Jews. In the 620s, as I mentioned to you before, AD, the first Arabs arrived, the Rashidas, the descendants of Muhammad. They're not from Haifa. They're from Arabia. And they conquer Israel by force, take it from the Byzantines. And they're there for about 120 years. Until in the 750s, they lose it to another growing Muslim empire, the Umayyads. Also not from Beersheba. They're from Damascus. And the Umayyads lose it to the Abbasids. Not from Bethlehem. They're from Baghdad. And the Baghdadids lose it to the Fatimids, who are from Egypt. And the Fatimids lose it to the Seljuks, another Muslim empire from Turkey. And the Seljuks lose it to the Crusaders, not indigenous to the land, I don't know if you've heard, who are from Europe. And the Crusaders lose it to Saladin's armies from Egypt, who loses it to his own slave army, the Mamelukes, an amazing people, by the way, beyond the scope of this speech. A slave people, probably from the steppe region of the Caucasus, who were enslaved by Saladin's descendants, the Muslim armies, and who revolted, took over most of the Middle East. And the Mamluks have it until 1517, when an overwhelming colonialist imperial force of Muslims from Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, takes over all of the Middle East, including the land of Israel, and they rule it as outside imperialists for 400 years, until the end of World War I, when the British win it in 1917 and throw out the Ottomans, and the British are there for 31 years. Also, not from Tel Aviv, by the way. And they rule it as foreign occupiers. And they, in 1948, decide, of course, to give it up to the United Nations, that partitions the land, and that gives and recognizes and ratifies the ancient Jewish heritage in the land of Israel. Here's the point, folks. The point is that if you go back 3,200 years ago to Merneptah's reign in Egypt, and then you look at all the different peoples who lived on planet Earth at that time, and you fast forward to today, there is only one people who still speaks the same language, who still practices the same religion, and who still lives and governs in the same land as they did 3,200 years ago. And those are the Jews who govern in the land of Israel today. Folks, if we care about the rights of indigenous people, there is no more successful story of an indigenous people's decolonization efforts. Its 2,000-year-old struggle to regain its own sovereignty over its own national homeland than the indigenous story of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And yet we are called colonists and settlers and occupiers in our own land. So I want to tell you about one last myth, and then I'll take whatever questions you got. And that's the biggest myth we hear all the time. And that's the myth that Jews are committing a genocide in Gaza. Folks, this is a very charged myth. But remember that genocide is a legal term. It is a question of law. Many of you are lawyers. Many of you are lawyers from Miami, it turns out. So you know that when we have a legal term, by the way, the term was created by Samuel Lemkin after World War II, a Jew, to describe the awful historical crime that was committed against the Jewish people. Again, you see, the enemies of Israel create this ingenious mirror. There was occupation in Israel, just not by the Jews. There has been genocide in the world, just not by the Jews, by the Muslims who committed mass carnage, purposely targeting civilians on October the 7th. So how do we know that there's no genocide going on? How do we know, in fact, that there's no violation of the laws of war that are going on in Israel, in Gaza? Well, first of all, let's describe it. The term genocide means the intent to wipe out an entire people. That's what it means. Folks, one simple fact. The population of Gaza has increased since October the 7th. That's a piece of evidence that you should know, because I like to play a game with my kids. I've got young kids that are probably burning part of this shul downstairs right now. I'm sorry, Rabbi. What's not like the others? What's not like the others? So you look at all the genocides in history. Look at the Holocaust. There were 18 million Jews in the world at that time. When the Germans were done, there were 12 million. That's genocide. The Armenian genocide, the Cambodian genocide. There were millions fewer of the victimized population when the genocide was done. The most recent genocide in Rwanda, 800,000 fewer people in Rwanda 30 days later. That's genocide. So from a simple mathematical proposition, this one is hard to square with the historical claim of genocide. What about the machinery of genocide? In every genocide in history, we see the machinery of genocide. Think about the Holocaust. Many of you have been to the concentration camps, where you see at industrial scale the killing of innocent civilians, gas chambers, crematorium. But you don't have to be the Nazis. You can have killing fields, like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, like what we saw in Rwanda, where you see fields with tens of thousands of bodies killed at one time. This is why, by the way, Hamas has always tried to create this image of these mass burial sites that couldn't be explained. Mass burial sites, by the way, that have been verified to exist all over Syria and Sudan. No protests at Colombia about those, by the way. And yet, every time inspectors come to these grave sites, they determine that the bodies are bodies of people who have been killed for many years. These are just cemeteries. Again, not like the others. So I told you that genocide relies on one critical element, the element of intent. So we have to ask ourselves, what has been the intent of the Israeli army? Well, Israel has done something remarkable. It has disclosed to the International Court of Justice the confidential communications from the War Cabinet. By the way, don't be confused. The Minister of Tourism and Diaspora Affairs can say what they want. They have absolutely no effect on what goes on in Gaza in the war. The war in Gaza is controlled by three people for most of the war. It was the defense minister, Ron Dermer, and Bibi Netanyahu. And for part of the war, there were two other people, Gadi Eisenkot and Benny Gantz, who are no longer in the War Cabinet. Their confidential communications on a daily basis have been made part of the evidence, public evidence at the trial, for all to see. And guess what those communications say? Nothing like what we would have seen in Nazi communiques, the kinds of indictable offenses that we saw in the Altman trial and in the Nuremberg trials. We see the War Cabinet giving specific instructions to the General Staff, who then relays specific instructions to the officers, who on a daily basis relays those instructions to the soldiers in the field, making clear that Israel will avoid civilian casualties when possible. Already inconsistent as a matter of law with any claim of genocide. But how do we know that they're following the law? Maybe the War Cabinet, maybe this is the one genocide in history where the War Cabinet says, follow the law, and the generals say, follow the law, and the officers say, follow the law, and you've got all these rogue soldiers who are out there committing mass genocide. The problem with that is that there's simply no evidence of it. I'll give you an example. One of the critical elements of the laws of war is what we call the law of distinction. You may have heard that in the news. The law of distinction is basically this. When I was a football player 2 knee surgeries ago, I was a quarterback. And in practice, I would wear a pink jersey. Okay, I'm not proud of it. But you got to protect the quarterback. And it made my mom very happy. Okay? And what the pink jersey meant was, you don't hit that guy. The law of distinction is precisely the opposite. The law of distinction is we wear uniforms in order to tell the combatant force on the enemy side, I am a combatant, and she is not. I am a soldier, and he is not. Hamas violates the law of distinction every single day in Gaza, obviously. The only time Hamas has ever worn uniforms is in these hostage exchange ceremonies to create the pretense that they're abiding by the law of distinction. But we know that Hamas does not abide by the law of distinction. But what about Israel? Well, we, the judges, we went to the Military Advocate General's office, the MAG. In America, we call it the JAG. There they call it MAG. And the MAG is in charge of a coterie of thousands of lawyers, young lawyers, like many of you and your children and grandchildren. And these lawyers are deployed all along the front in Gaza, in the field with the commanding officers. We actually went with a coterie of MAG lawyers to the Gaza border to see how it works in their trucks and their command centers, with their screens and their video equipment. And what happens is this. In the Israeli army, unlike the US Army, the MAG's advice to the commanding officer is not precatory. It's not aspirational. Unlike in the United States, by the way. In the United States, the JAG officer gives the commanding officer advice, but the commanding officer can fire anyway if he thinks that it's appropriate. In Israel, it's mandatory. So what we see, and I've seen 50 videos like this, is you've got a drone or an F-35 over a Hamas target. You see the guys with the Kalashnikovs and the scarves, the same scarves they wear at Harvard, and the pilot says, "Here, I'm ready to fire." And then something amazing happens. A nerdy lawyer, a Jewish lawyer, comes over the airwave and says, "What's that on the top right part of the screen?" That's two children playing soccer. "What's that on the bottom left part of the screen?" Three women holding a loaf of bread having a conversation 25 meters away. Strike canceled. Strike canceled. Strike canceled. Over and over and over again, Israel is relinquishing offensive superior force in order to protect and preserve the lives of innocent Palestinians when they can, and we'll get to that. Completely inconsistent with the claim of genocide. What about the warning system? There's a brief by the high-level military group, the HLMG. It's a collection of the most senior officers and generals from all of the Western armies, America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all the Europeans. They submitted a brief. It's only 13 pages. Anyone can read it. It's online. To the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And they said Israel has a warning system that is by itself, if it were the only piece of evidence, completely inconsistent with any claim of genocide. Why? Israel has sent over 20 million text messages, over 19 million flyers and leaflets, over 15 million phone calls and social media posts to the civilian population of Gaza, telling them precisely which buildings and blocks would be attacked the following day and where the safe areas would be. It's tremendously frustrating to Israelis and people like me who have family members who are soldiers in Gaza. Why? Because when you tell the civilian population exactly where you're going to be attacking the next day, it's not just the civilians who know. I was a quarterback. The most important thing in football, as in war, is offensive surprise. And Israel relinquishes the benefit of offensive surprise on a daily basis in Gaza, thus endangering the lives of its own sons and daughters in order to preserve the lives of innocent Palestinians. One of our judges, who was an army officer before he became a federal judge, asked the MAG, "This is crazy. We Americans would never do this. Why do you do this?" And the MAG said very simply and without a smile, "You have a veto in the UN Security Council, and we're Jews." Completely inconsistent with the claim of genocide. By the way, the HLMG officers say in their brief, not only does Israel have a warning system unlike any other warning system that any military has deployed anywhere in the world, but they said no other army would even be permitted by its own population to implement those kinds of warning systems because of the danger that it would expose their own soldiers to. And no civilian population in America or Canada or Australia would abide by that. But Israel does it every single day in Gaza. And by the way, the numbers bear it out. You've heard that over the course of the last 2 years, Hamas has told us that 56,000 people have been killed in Gaza. Israel has already published the names, ranks, and serial numbers of about 25 or 26,000 of them who are card-carrying Hamas and Islamic Jihad members. Even if you believe Hamas's numbers, in other words. And you shouldn't. Abraham Weinad, by the way, a professor of data science at University of Pennsylvania, has published a great article about this. The Hamas numbers are completely bogus. They increase by the same rate every single day, even if there's no Air Force bombing that day, even if the Israeli army wasn't in an urban area that day. They increased the same in February of 2024 as they did in January 2024, even though we know by now that the Israeli army had stopped on the edge of Rafah at that time, so there wasn't active engagement around that time. You shouldn't believe the numbers. The numbers are completely bogus. But even if you believe the numbers, that means that Israel has a civilian to military kill ratio of 1 to 1. 1 militant for every civilian who is killed. Folks, John Spencer and Richard Kemp, a colonel in the British Army, and John Spencer, the head of urban warfare studies at West Point, you may have heard of it. They've written a number of articles about this. I was actually just with Colonel Kemp in DC earlier last week. He thinks the whole claim of genocide is the most preposterous thing, by the way, he's ever seen in 50 years as a military officer. He's been to Gaza and Israel many times. And he has told me it's the least likely urban warfare scenario in the history of warfare to be designated as a genocide. In their studies, in fact, of every urban warfare incident in the 20th and 21st century, they've determined that on average, an urban warfare scenario results in a kill ratio of 1 to 9. 1 militant for every 9 civilians. That's not because every war that's ever happened has been a genocide. It's because urban warfare is horrible, and it's hard, and it needs to be precise. We, the Americans and our allies in Iraq and Afghanistan, we set the gold standard. We had a kill ratio of 1 to 4.5, maybe 1 to 5. We still don't know, by the way. That's why when you see an attack happens at night and the next morning Hamas says 387 people are killed, you know that's not true. We still don't know how many people the United States and Great Britain killed in Mosul to root out ISIS in 2012. And we've been investigating it for 13 years. So the United States set the gold standard in Iraq and Afghanistan with a kill ratio of 1 to 4.5. But Israel has a kill ratio of 1 to 1, fighting in a dense urban environment where Hamas is purposefully trying to increase the number of civilian casualties by firing from homes, from bedrooms, from mosques, from hospitals. One of you, I saw one of my interns, Isaiah. I had an intern, Josh Bluestein, whose first cousin was killed just a few months ago by stepping on a landmine inside a kindergarten classroom in an elementary school in Gaza. That's the urban warfare at a level no army has ever seen before, John Spencer has repeatedly said. And yet, despite those odds, and despite that complexity, Israel has the lowest militant to civilian kill ratio in the history of urban warfare. And yet, it is Israel that is being hauled before the ICJ and the ICC on false and preposterous claims of genocide. So let me leave you with this. On our first judges trip, we came to Re'im, the site of the music festival massacre. Many of you maybe have been to the Nova exhibit. And it's an unbelievable scene. There are 364 young, beautiful people, men and women, who were killed there. More Jews murdered in one place than any other place on earth since the Holocaust. And what they've done is very powerful. They have a mound of sand for each person who fell, with a wooden stick, and then a picture of the person who was killed there. And we, the judges, we came off the bus, and we were overwhelmed by the sobbing of a woman who was lying prostrate on the mound of her son. And her family members were trying to pull her off of the mound, but she was digging into the earth and screeching uncontrollably, and she would not be moved. And we're suddenly these 15 judges from America, and I just thought, we have to give her space. We got to get out of here. So I started walking over to the right, and we came upon a clearing. And I recognized the clearing because in the 47-minute Hamas video I mentioned to you, at the very end of the movie, an IDF soldier arrives at that clearing. That's where the bar for the music festival was. It was a long rectangular bar with a low rectangular fence around its periphery. And the Chayal, the soldier, yells out, you can see it through his body cam footage. He yells out, Mishu Chai, is anyone alive? And he leans over the low fence of the bar, and it's unbelievable. It's like a Holocaust movie, but in color. Bodies of bartenders and partygoers in miniskirts piled on top of one another. That's where we were, on that clearing. And as I got to the clearing, I thought I heard music. And I thought I was going crazy. But then I looked up and there was a big circle of about 50 women, all arm in arm. And one of them turned around and said, please join us. And so I did. And that's when I noticed that all these other federal judges from America, non-Jews, were interspersing themselves along the circle too. And then we began to sing. And you know what we sang? We sang Hatikva. Just think about what a symbol that is of these people. These 50 women had left whatever they were doing on a Thursday in Tel Aviv and rented a bus and taken a day off work and traveled all the way to the south by Gaza, an active war zone, to come to the spot where more Jews were killed than any other place on earth since the camps were released, to sing a song, not of vengeance or hatred or vindictiveness, but of hope. Because that's what tikva means. It means hope. Hope for each other. Hope for their people. Hope for that land for which they and their ancestors have fought these 3,200 years. A people who are deserving of our love, our admiration, and our support. Thank you all very much.
What a great historical report and knowledge. Years ago, Ron Drummond was here, and I said, Israel for the last 50 years has the worst PR. He said, yes, you, in a very good context, bring it present. Thank you. My question to you is, when you're with these college kids and you don't have a lot of time to give your whole intelligent talk, is there a way to cut through it quickly and to be able to say, my father said there was very little justice in the world, and I remember when I was in Jordan, we brought Iraqi children medical supplies because the hospitals had been picked clean through the Jordanian, the Iraqi, and the Bosnian embassy. And they were Jews. We were the Jews. In any case, I remember in Jordan, a woman said, my father and my grandfather, I lost their land, I lost their farm. She was about to take my earring off, and I pulled back, and she said, that's how I feel. You took my land. I have the key to the place. And I think I said it wasn't fair, and I acknowledge it. But I also would say to these young kids, are you willing to give back the home you grew up in to the Indians? Are you willing to give your condo in New York or in Boston back to the Indians? Would that have any way of getting through to them? Because I think we are naive and idealistic, which is lovely, but we're not grounded in reality as well.
I think that on college campuses, for the most part, there are three groups of people. There is one group of people, a minority, a small minority, very loud, who will never be convinced no matter what you say, and that's one part of it. There's another minority on the other side mostly Christians, Mormons, Catholics, and some Jews, who also will never be convinced of the other side. They love Israel, they support Israel, they think it's the home of the Jewish people. And then there's the 70%, let's call it, the vast majority of the students who just want to go to class. And they don't really know that much. And I'll tell you a story. I was the October 7th day speaker at Duke last year. And I gave a similar speech to what you heard now, somewhat different at the time. And then after, I was taken out by the dean and other people to the lawn, and it was amazing. There was 1,200 Israeli flags on a lawn at Duke, one for each person who was killed. Unbelievable sight. And some of them had fallen down, so me and some of the U.S. Marshals who were there, were putting them back. And suddenly these two kids come out of class, young kids, and they walk past, and I hear them. One kid says to the other, "What's that all about?" And the second kid goes, "I don't know, something about a war someplace." And it's funny because, we live every day these news, but the vast majority of the kids don't. And they don't know about the keys. And by the way, the keys is a complete nonsense fiction that was created. That we in the law, this is a whole beyond the scope of this talk, but we in the law have the dog that didn't bark, right? You've heard of that analogy? The dog that didn't bark. And the analogy goes something like this. There's a woman, she's murdered in her home, and she has a very loud guard dog, and the neighbors report that nobody came in, nobody came out, but the dog did not bark that night. And the testimony is that the one person the dog knows that he never barks in front of is either the woman, who's now dead, or the husband, who wasn't there at the time. So who's the suspect? The husband. In Israel, on the day of the founding, 1948, there was about, it's not super clear, let's call it between 600,000 and 700,000 Arabs who were living in what's now the land of Israel. When the Arab armies invaded on May the 15th of 1948, we have their recordings, by the way. You can go to the Israel Museum and listen to the recordings. The Arab armies were clear over the radio for days before the invasion began that they intended to, quote, push the Jews into the sea. Now they say from the river to the sea, which I agree has a better jingle to it. Back then it was push the Jews into the sea. Doesn't sound so violent. You can get progressives to like it. Push the Jews into the sea, and what? They told the local population, leave now so that we can fight freely, and everyone that's walking around will know it's a Jew, and we'll kill them. If you're there, it's going to create difficulties for us. And when we come back, the good news is you'll get twice the land. You'll get your home back, and you'll get their home too. Just like, by the way, what happened in the Holocaust to so many of our families. And hundreds of thousands of them left because they were told to by the Arab commanders. In fact, after decades of historical research, there's really only one series of villages that there's any evidence for that David Ben-Gurion ordered them to be evacuated. And that's in the area of Deir el-Yassin, close to Jerusalem, because the people in that town were killing IDF, back then Haganah soldiers, as they passed. So why is it the dog that didn't bark? Because half stayed. Half of the Arabs in the land chose not to leave. And they stayed. And at the founding of the State of Israel became full-fledged Israeli citizens with full and equal social and political rights. One of them now serves on the Supreme Court of Israel. Many of them serve in the Knesset. I've met them many times. They're the dog that didn't bark. If there had really been a widespread policy of ethnic cleansing to kick these people out of their homes, we wouldn't have expected hundreds of thousands of them to have remained. The IDF, whatever you might say about it, it is effective. So it would not have allowed these people to remain if, in fact, these people had been ethnically cleansed. But the point is, the people in the broad middle on these college campuses who don't know that much, maybe don't care that much, they are open to being taught what the real history shows and what the law demands and requires on questions of apartheid, on questions of occupation, on questions of genocide. That has been my experience over the last 2 years, and if it hadn't been that, I wouldn't keep doing it. Yes, sir.
I understand, and I might be incorrect, that there was a Jewish historian who still may be alive. I think his name is
Benny Morris.
Benny Morris, thank
I
you.
know Benny
Who
Morris.
said that the IDF went into villages like Deir Yassin, I think,
Deir Yassin, yeah.
and killed civilians. My read is that they dressed up as women and got discovered as fighters, just like Hamas today. Can you deny or can you affirm that particular?
Deir Yassin is an incident that has been very much studied. But Benny Morris, by the way, a great, what they call revisionist Israeli historian, who now, if you listen to him today, is very clear that everything he said in the 70s and 80s he believes has been contradicted and refuted by historical records that have now been declassified. So that's one thing to say about it. And Benny Morris has become a very avid supporter of the war in Gaza and actually has become extreme the other way, where he says the biggest mistake the Jews made at the time of the founding was not to have kicked out all of the Arabs from Israel, a controversial position, but obviously belies the contention that there was a systematic ethnic cleansing. But what you're talking about is Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin is a small Arab village. This has been studied by Palestinian, Israeli, and American historians. An Arab village right on the outskirts of Jerusalem. This is beyond the scope of this talk, but at the time of the founding, there were three rival Jewish armies. There was the Irgun, there was the Haganah and the Palmach, and then there was the Stearns gang. They had different interests and different commanders. They had agreed that the Irgun would take over Deir Yassin in order to open a pathway to Jerusalem. They went in with a truck with loudspeakers all around the truck, warning the Arab civilians to leave. The truck got stuck in a muddy ditch. It's not clear whether the Arab civilians heard or didn't hear, but the people in the village certainly heard that IDF was coming because the Haganah and the Irgun began taking sniper fire from the village. And based on that sniper fire, the Israeli soldiers did come in and did kill, at first, for the first about 10 years after the founding, the hypothesis was that it was about 200 to 300 Arabs in the town. A recent, by recent I mean about 2013, Palestinian analysis of Deir Yassin, which by the way was the worst of all the incidents in the War of Independence in 1948, has now said that about 90 to 97 people were killed in Deir Yassin. Not clear how many of those were combatants who were killed in the village. Civilians were killed. Civilians were killed on both sides during that war. Deir Yassin was the worst incident of the War of 1948. And it now is clear from both Arab and Israeli researchers that the IDF opened fire only after taking sniper fire from inside the village. I hope I answered your question. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Are you being welcomed in college campuses?
The question is whether I'm being welcomed. I mean, by some people, you know, not everybody.
Are the universities open to you coming in?
Oh, yes, very much so, actually. And in fact, I'm teaching at Columbia now, which is ironic. And I'll tell you, you know, I'm obviously an affirmative action case. They wanted me to come in to deflect attention from everything that's going on in the news. And I will say my first lecture at Columbia went really, really well. And the university decided that I would be not just at the law school, that they would host me at the rotunda of Low Library. For those of you who went to Columbia, it's the center of campus. Just as context, for 4 years as a student, I never went in that place. And now I was the featured speaker, and the president of the university, the one who's about to be fired, introduced me just to show support. And the entire board of trustees came and sat in the audience. We had about 300 people, and there wasn't a single protest. I did have an incident where I went out to get like a coffee before my talk, and there was a little stand with a bake sale and some muffins. I was like, oh, maybe I'll get a muffin. You know, I talked for an hour. It's good to have some calories. And then I was like, well, why are they all wearing COVID masks? It's like the middle of the day in 2025. And then I saw it. I was standing right at the bake sale, muffins for Gaza. So I was like, first of all, I didn't want anybody to take a picture of me there, and my wife would divorce me. But second, I thought, you know, maybe I'll go up and ask whether I could buy a muffin for one of the American hostages. But I decided not to be too incendiary. But the point is that, look, I'm a judge, so I don't get into politics, but the universities are changing, trying to change, at least slowly. and in their own way. And they're very imperfect places with a deep, deep rot that has been allowed to fester for many, many years. And but I'm teaching at Columbia, as I said, and just 2 months ago, I was surprised to learn that I was the admitted Students' Day speaker at Yale Law School, my own law school alma mater. Of all the people that went to Yale Law School, they picked me to convince the undergrads to go to Yale. Again, affirmative action case, just to make the Trump administration happy. But I feel like I am being welcomed. There are protests. There are people who wear I call them the terror scarves. And there are people who don't like it that I'm there. But the universities are open to it. Yes, sir.
What is your opinion of the IDF's approach to journalistic access to Gaza?
Yeah, it's a very good question and a complicated one. The IDF allows journalists to come into Gaza, and the IDF, when you talk to the spokesperson's unit, and Peter Lerner was the head when I first went, and then Hagari, and now it's Defreen, they have two sort of countervailing concerns. On the one hand, they want to bring people in because remember what goes on in Gaza. Gaza was a totalitarian state. So Gaza was run by a totalitarian government that controlled every aspect of Gaza. That's why when you see that Noah Argamani was rescued from the home of a doctor and a journalist, that's not a surprise, right? Because people were like, oh my God, a doctor and a journalist were holding hostages. You have it backwards. You can only get a job as a journalist and a doctor in Gaza if you're a supporter of Hamas. It's the spoil system on steroids. So Israel has, on the one hand, an interest in bringing Western journalists in, be it CNN or the New York Times or whatever it is, to come in and provide some independent analysis of what's going on. At the same time, as you've seen, unfortunately, today, if you've been looking at your phones in the last 2 hours or so, Gaza, even today, is an incredibly dangerous place. 5 Israeli soldiers, at least, were killed just before I started speaking. And if it's dangerous today, when the IDF controls about 75% of all the land in Gaza, and there are rival clans who are killing Hamas, which has not happened in Gaza since 2007, the Al-Shabaab clan and others, it's much safer today than it was a year ago or even 6 months ago. Imagine what it was like back then. So their fear is we're going to bring journalists in, we're going to get into a firefight, a journalist is going to get killed, a journalist is going to get wounded, we're not going to be able to take him out. These are countervailing considerations. So they bring the journalists in when they can. And the way that typically works is they come in, they clear an area, and then they bring the journalists in with helmets and APCs, the armored personnel carriers, to inspect and report on what they've seen. But the journalists are not actually coming in, generally speaking, while the fighting is actually taking place. Although a lot of the Israeli soldiers now, like policemen in the United States, are carrying body camera footage. And a lot of that body camera footage is being turned over to the international courts. Omri Sender, by the way, is the chief lawyer in charge of representing Israel in the international tribunals, and has become a close friend over the last 2 years. And he has to, with his team, sift through this footage because it actually ends up being tremendously helpful to the IDF's cause. Because what you see is warning, like we talked about, warning systems, clearing, the preserving of innocent civilian life. The people who end up being killed in these rooms when the soldiers come in are mostly terrorists with their own machine guns. So you can see a lot of that on the body camera footage, but you don't see it from CNN. Now, the Israeli army has been criticized for that because, the United States did have reporters who would go to Afghanistan in the mountains. It's a very different war, as I alluded to earlier. Hamas is coming up from underneath the ground in a way that they didn't in Iraq and in a way that they hadn't in Afghanistan. Much more dangerous, in fact, than anything we faced in those 2 wars. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the clans and Shabab. Would you be interested in commenting on this new fellow?
This is something that the Israelis have been trying to do for a long time, actually, and it's only now coming into public light. And Israel now, as you can see, I think has a political incentive in bringing this out to light because Israel has been trying to arm these local clans. I'll just say one thing historically about the Palestinians, which Palestinians who we, the judges, meet with will be the first to tell you. The Palestinians are Arab clans, and these clans have ruled particular territory for hundreds of years. These clans are, think of them as family, kin, tribe, and they very much warred with one another even before the early Jews came in the 1880s. And so, like the idea that there's a Palestinian Authority who's going to run the West Bank and Gaza all together as this one neat sort of entity just is belied by the sort of historical evidence of how these families are constructed and how they interact with one another. What happened in 2006, this is not well understood in the West, there were actually elections that President Bush required in 2006 after the 2005 withdrawal from Gaza. And Israel said, you do not want elections with these people, you may not like what you find. And the United States basically said, we want elections. This was the era of freeing the Iraqi people. And there were elections for the entirety of the Palestinian territories. Hamas won overwhelmingly, not just in Gaza. This is where the reporting in the United States kind of gets it wrong. Hamas won the majority of the seats to what would have been a Palestinian Authority parliament that would sit in Ramallah. And that means they won a majority of the votes in both what's now the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and Gaza. What happened is that Fatah, ruled by Mahmoud Abbas, who's, by the way, in his 20th year of his 4-year term, he said, we're not seating the electors. We're not going to seat Hamas's votes. And so there were going to be no Hamas representatives in the parliament from any of the Palestinian territories. Hamas tried to rebel in the West Bank, but Israel had such an infiltration of Judea and Samaria with IDF presence after Oslo that they weren't able to do that. And the IDF really has protected the Palestinian Authority ever since. In Gaza, since Israel had withdrawn in 2005, there was no IDF presence to protect the Palestinian Authority. And so Hamas basically killed off all of the PA representatives in Gaza and took power in 2006. What happened then was basically a war against the local clansmen who were trying to resist. Think about it like a gang war throughout block to block in Gaza from 2006 until about 2008. And they ended up killing off the heads of all these clan families. And there's a great deal of bitterness even today, as we're now seeing. Israel's plan since the war started was to try to empower these clans to take back their neighborhoods from Hamas, something Israel really wasn't able to do before because it wasn't occupying neighborhoods. Since Gideon's chariot started at the end of May, Israel has decided to start occupying neighborhoods so it can clear a whole area of Rafah and say, here, we don't want to provide like municipal governance to these people. You, Al-Shabaab, you were the people who ran this area for 100 years before Hamas. You run it. And now that Israel is staying, these clans are starting to feel empowered to actually take responsibility. One more question.
What do you
I know you. I went to high school with your wife. Look at that.
What do you think is going to happen with Gaza post-war?
What do you think is going to happen with Gaza? That's a very complicated question. Look, it's really not clear. Here's what I will tell you the reality is, okay? I'm in this secret group at Columbia, and it's 28 of us, and it's Hillary Clinton, and it's Jack Lew, and it's me, and it's Palestinian leaders, and it's Saudis and Emiratis, and some very top-level Israelis. And we get together and we talk about the future of Gaza. And of course, there's disagreement about the particulars, but there's one thing everybody agrees with. I was shocked, actually. The Israelis agree, the Americans agree, the Saudis agree, the Palestinians agree, and the Emiratis agree. What is it? That Hamas can never run Gaza again. Period. Everybody agrees. You saw when there was this plan to have the Gazans leave, that it encouraged the Egyptians to get all the Arab states together and come up with their own plan, which they had refused to do before. And you look at their plan, and you might have things that you object to about that plan. But here's the reality about that plan. On page 1, they say the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Hamas can never rule Gaza again. So what does that look like? Well, I don't know. Right now, what Israel is trying to do is to take and hold land and to provide a separate mechanism of providing aid and humanitarian assistance and food to the population of Gaza. There's one thing that Hamas has had since the beginning of the war is a monopoly on who distributes aid in Gaza. The UN brings the aid in, Hamas steals the aid, takes a lot of it for itself, and then creates a black market where they're charging 2, 3, 10 times what the food is worth to the population. The population then is beholden to Hamas, because Hamas has all the food, all the medicine, all the fuel. So the administration, together with the Israelis, have created this GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. So I'm surprised that it's controversial. It is the death knell of Hamas. It disintermediates Hamas from the provision of food, which means that all these people who hated Hamas, but who couldn't speak up against Hamas because they were getting their sustenance from Hamas, now have an alternative mechanism for receiving food, medicine, and fuel from someone other than Hamas. Hamas will fight tooth and nail to the last person to make sure, both on the ground and in the international press, that the GHF looks like Nazis and is totally discredited because without the provision of food, Hamas doesn't exist. So how will that happen? Well, hopefully from Israel's perspective, there will be a hostage deal that will release some of the hostages. Whether Hamas is willing to release all the hostages, this is a very difficult question. I don't know if there are any Israelis in the room. It's a very complicated situation because if you're Hamas, you know that what Israel wants is to get all its hostages back. Then you build one rocket launcher and Israel comes back and kills you all. So Hamas doesn't want that, and they're not done. So there are a lot of people within Hamas who are saying we cannot release all the hostages because that's our only way of survival. But the future of Gaza, it is my hope, and it's the position of both the United States and Israel and all the Arab countries, is that Hamas can never control Gaza again. All right, I think that was the last question. Thank you all very much.